Hello and welcome to the Legal Eagle this week. My guest on the show this week is a man who could have been a Supreme Court judge for over a decade. He's brilliant, honest, forthright, and eloquent. He was a senior advocate at barely 40 years of age. We re-welcome on the show on part 2 of the Legal Eagle this week, Mr. Srihari Ane. If you could change one thing about the courts, Mr. Ane, what would it be?
There are lots of bees in my legal bonnet, but one or two of them with which I'm most concerned was something that I have been taking up for a long time. I believe the courts should stop this business of going on vacations merely because they don't feel like working. There's no point in saying we work so hard that we need vacations. All that is just a whole lot of hogwash. We need to work not once, but in 2 shifts on 365 days a year. And I mean the High Court and the Supreme Court. Believe me, the infrastructure exists. You already have courtrooms. You already have staff. You'll have to increase the staff, of course, to work in 2 shifts. You'll have to increase the number of judges, of course, to work in 2 shifts. But imagine the biggest legal reform that can be brought is to make sure that the courts are not limited to working 160 days or 240 days in the Supreme Court and the High Court respectively. It's just a waste of public time and public money. And then we hold seminars ad nauseum about how to improve the system. When my Lord Justice Lodha, one of my favorite judges incidentally, became Chief Justice of India, I wrote to him requesting him to take up the matter of making the courts work longer. And he did take it up. You know, he took it up more or less at the time I was Advocate General. And he wrote to all the bar councils saying that please let us reduce the number of days of holidays in the High Court and Supreme Court. And do you know, except for 2 Advocate Generals, one of Maharashtra, that was I, and one from Chhattisgarh, my friend Jugal Kishore Gilda, we were the only 2 who said, yes, let us work the whole year. All the other high courts and all the other bar councils unanimously said, nothing doing, we must work only the number of days we work. And double shift, forget it. There's a brilliant report written by a now retired judge of the Bombay High Court, Justice Dabholkar, about how the courts can optimize their time. It's not been acted upon, not even been discussed by the judges. Do you know our courts are the only institution that is not professionally managed? All this business about master of the rolls and who draws up the roster and how do cases go. The last big legal reform was during Justice Ahmadi's day, when he brought in computerization. No legal reform after that. I was hoping that this COVID-19 situation would lead to a breakthrough and permit courts to function online. We are reverting slowly back to physical hearings, and many judges would prefer that to online hearings. Although I am glad to say that under the chairmanship, I believe, of Justice Chandrachud of the Supreme Court, there is a committee actively considering how to make more online hearings. If that goes underway, there will be a change. But why can't we reduce our holidays, for God's sake? Why can't we work in 2 shifts? This is a proposal that I think needs to be seriously considered if you want to bring a change in the current legal scenario. That's one change I would like. Justice Lodha tried it. The Chief Justice was unsuccessful because the bar and the high courts don't like change.
Mr. Ane, you've also championed the cause of Vidarbha. Your grandfather and parliamentarian Bapu Ane espoused the cause of Vidarbha. Please explain to us the reason for this.
It's not I and my grandfather alone. There's a whole lot of people in Vidarbha who champion the cause of Vidarbha. The BJP at its national level has a resolution asking for Vidarbha to be made a state. Congress party has 2 resolutions asking Vidarbha to be made a state. In fact, in Vidarbha, they win seats only on the Vidarbha issue. So the championing of the cause is perhaps is more diluted than limited only to myself. As a matter of fact, I'm not its leader. I'm one of those who champion it, but I'm not the leader of the Vidarbha movement in the classic sense. Why do I want Vidarbha? I'm going to make it simple because this is a topic, once again, that is quite exhaustively requiring of discussion. Basically, there is huge absence of development in Vidarbha. If Vidarbha was as developed, let us say, as Pune or even Nasik, I'm not even talking about Bombay, although for historic reasons, Vidarbha is the second capital of Maharashtra. Even if we had development, I don't think we would have had a demand for separate statehood. In fact, Balasaheb Thackeray, at the first time when BJP came into power with Shiv Sena in the state, made a speech in Vidarbha, in Ramtek, saying that if I don't manage to develop Vidarbha in 2 years, I will myself demand a separate state. The reason for Vidarbha's separate demand is the total absence of development. Hence the question, what's the problem in development? Why can't Vidarbha get developed? The answer is simple. Vidarbha is not Maharashtra. Vidarbha is not Bombay. If you want to understand how developments happen in the country, developments are geographically centered. They deal with a certain people living in a certain area. There's no point developing Vidarbha the way you have developed, let us say, Pune, Baramati area with sugarcane. We have a cotton crop. We depend on rainwater for our harvest, for our cultivation. We have no irrigation. Now, if you're wanting to develop Vidarbha in the way you've developed Maharashtra, it's never going to be developed. You need to be able to think locally. You have to be able to address the problems then and there. That can't be done. We've had two huge industrial estates brought in, Mihan and Butibori, by acquiring land from my farmers. Not a single industry there, except one Raymond factory, which is barely surviving, and one in Indorama, which is collapsing. Except for two major factories, there's nothing in the industrial growth area. Why does that happen? Because you're thinking of the kind of industry Pune has in its MIDCs. You're thinking of the kind of industries Thane has, that Belapur has. They're never going to work in Vidarbha. What's the point of trying to develop Vidarbha in terms of Bombay? It will fail. Also, you can't forget, and this is perhaps the most important reason, the nature of the people. We are Central Indian people. We still talk Hindi. We eat the kind of food that is eaten in Bhopal, that is eaten in Jabalpur, that is eaten in Hyderabad, and we have nothing to do with pav vada that is eaten in Bombay. We dress different. Our colors are different. Our tastes are different. Our language is different. On that basis, unless you give them an identity of a state, don't expect development. Therefore, the statehood for Vidarbha.
I can understand from the passion in your voice how strongly you feel about this, and I understand and respect that. I move on to asking you something that we have been seeing in the judges, in the judiciary for a very long time, I would say, when it comes to the judiciary, and this is talking about a certain group of lawyers who are always trying to dominate and prevail their views over the judiciary, to try and sort of intimidate the judiciary sometimes try and besmirch the reputation of the judiciary. What could your message to these lawyers, this set of lobby that we call them at Republic TV be, because they are trying their best to try and destabilize the system?
I'm going to answer this with a slight caveat. I don't agree that there is a group of lawyers alone which tries to do this. I think the phenomenon is more universal than that. But you must go to why we do it. Why do lawyers try to dominate? That's how we've been taught to live. That's how our profession teaches us to be. By nature, we have to sit on somebody's head in order to get something out. My wife says I've become one of the most acrimonious men she's ever met after our marriage. She refuses to attribute any part of acrimony to her existence in the marriage, but she believes that it is because of my being a lawyer that I fight about everything. She's right. I was a very pleasant man before I became a lawyer. I was extremely happy. I was extremely congenial. It was hail fellows, well met all the way. After I became a lawyer, I became bitter. I became angry. I became superior. I became dominating. And why? Because if I am not that, how do I win? I don't win merely on the merit of the case. I win on the volume of my voice. I remember Mr. Tulzapurkar, one of our finest lawyers in Bombay, always spoke at a high pitch. And judges who came from other courts were often surprised as to why this lawyer is always shouting at them. And then they asked Mr. Tulzapurkar, we can hear you. Could you speak more quietly? And Tulzapurkar gave them a classic answer. He said, don't mistake the tone of my voice for anything other than the fact that I'm competing with the sound of traffic that's going on outside on the city of Bombay. I have to talk loud in order to reach your lordship. Of course, eventually the high courts got air conditioned and those windows are closed. But we do get loud, we do get aggressive. One of my juniors told me this once. He said, sir, do you know what you do when you start attacking the court? I said, what? He says, you twist your gown at the back, you raise one foot on the chair you were sitting on, you lean across the court, and you get onto the desk in front of you and you start yelling your head off. I said, no, I didn't even notice that. I don't even know that I do something like that. But the fact is that by nature, lawyers dominate. And they use every trick, good and bad, to get what they want. Some of the things you mentioned should be seen as a part of that. But having said that, I do agree that sometimes we try to manipulate the courts. We try, to use your own language, to bring social activism into our argument inside the court and put up a tamasha more to browbeat and pressurize the court. Some courts do succumb to it. The weakness lies there, not here. It's not the lawyers who are wrong, of course they are, but it's not the lawyers who are only wrong. The judges are more wrong than lawyers if they listen to this kind of rubbish. They should just learn to put their foot down. After all, as I told the judge, some judges some time back, finally you write the judgment. We only make the arguments. So you can decide how the case goes. But believe me, the fault is not of lawyers. I'm going to give you a couple of examples and then move off from this topic. There was a matter in which I was intervening on behalf of Sharad Joshi, the farm activist. He was alive at that point of time, in a division bench in Bombay High Court. And as an intervener, as you know, I had no right to be heard except by leave of the court because I'm not a party to the main proceeding that was going on. And the judges, the senior judge, had some built-in aversion to Mr. Sharad Joshi. So he wasn't going to listen to me. He wouldn't listen to me. And finally, when the petitioner and the respondent's arguments were done, I stood up and told the judges that I wanted to be heard on my intervention. And the senior judge very angrily told me, Mr. Rane, if you want to be heard, you'll have to pay costs of 10,000 rupees. Well, a fairly big figure at the time when Sharad Joshi was alive. And I don't know why. I lose my cool quite often. I try not to, but I do. I went back to the judge immediately on the floor of the court and said, in that case, my lord, would your lordship accept 30,000 rupees and allow me to argue for half an hour? The entire legislature of Maharashtra found me guilty of contempt of court, but in their convicting sentence, they said, although Mr. Rane is guilty and convicted, we will not punish him because of his exemplary conduct. I think some of your goodness works in your favor at points of time. But the fact is that the judges sometimes deserve what they get. And if they're getting it from the lawyers, that's only because lawyers are the only ones who can give it back to them.
So this is a question I often ask on this debate, on this show about the lobby members, and I have never heard an answer that's been more humorous and more beautifully articulated, something to do nothing with the lobby, but having answered about the prowess of how the lawyers actually are. It's been delightful to hear it. I want to now ask you, sir, about women in the legal profession. We meet them sometimes in the Supreme Court, sometimes in the High Court, sometimes in the district courts. There are many of them, some of them extremely brilliant, most of them sharp. Do you think they get their due in the legal profession?
No, women are badly treated. And I mean not only by the lawyers, by the judges, by the clients as well. And this is universal, all the way from the Supreme Court down into all the high courts. I'm not very familiar with the trial courts, but I would assume that it is worse in the trial courts. If our enlightened upper courts, like the High Court and the Supreme Court, I don't mean the judges, I mean the system, is unable to treat women equally, then how much worse must it be at the ground level? Why do I say they're badly treated? It's in not only in the field of law, but also in the field of merely being a woman, they're badly treated. Do you know, there was this wonderful story that Justice Sujata Manohar once told the bar when she was addressing us. It's about a lady lawyer, the first lady lawyer actually, a barrister called Tata, Mrs. Tata. Now, Mrs. Tata was on the original side of the Bombay High Court, the first lady to join the Bombay Bar, and completely briefless. Absolutely no brief for many, many, many years. And finally, one day, a solicitor came up to her and said, "Madam, my client wants me to brief you." And of course, after getting over her initial sense of shock and delight, she wanted to know why she was being briefed. And the solicitor hemmed and hawed and refused to answer. But she insisted. She said, "Until you tell me why you're briefing me, I'm not going to take the brief." So the solicitor says to her, "My client gave me two reasons. And the reasons are these. One, our case is so good that even a lady can't go and lose it. And the second reason is, I want to see my opponent defeated at the hands of a woman." Now, that's the mentality with which women lawyers are viewed in our courts. Do you know the Bombay High Court, to my memory, to my present memory, has only two senior counsels designated as from women who are wearing a square gown, Rajani Iyer and Miss Anklesaria. Only two senior counsels out of ladies, and one in Nagpur, Kumkum Sirpurkar. That's the end. And this is the Bombay High Court, the most enlightened court you will find in the country, arguably. Two senior counsels. How many ladies make to the Supreme Court in proportion to the men? And they are, despite genocide and killing of girl child, they are almost 48% of our population. Why shouldn't there be a reservation for women in judiciary? I don't understand. After all, we've got it everywhere else. What's wrong with, why can we not be fair to women? Do you know that until Justice Dalveer Bhandari became our Chief Justice at Bombay, the original side Bombay Bar had one toilet for women, and the appellate side Bombay Bar had one toilet for women. There was not a single toilet for litigant women who came into the Bombay High Court. Now, that's how we treat our women. What do you expect of them? If a junior born of a certain family, which has been in law for 3 generations, stands up before a court, he will be listened differently than a lady who comes without any wherewithal and who's probably arguing far better than that junior is. There is a built-in off-handed manner in which not only the bench, but the bar treats a lady. There was one particular judge of the Bombay High Court in whose court women have wept because of the bad treatment they've been given. I happened to be witness to one time when he was haranguing a lady lawyer, and I couldn't take it anymore. I used my prerogative as a senior counsel and went up to the bar and told the judge that this has to stop. If he doesn't want to hear her matter, he should say so, but he cannot be heard to say things to the lady the way he was saying it. But how many judges would stop because of this? how often have we seen that women are not treated equally? They prepare as hard. They've worked in the same offices that men have. They've gone to the best of law schools. My own daughter-in-law ranked at the top of her class in the Bangalore National Law School. And she goes and becomes a partner now in Allen and Overy, one of the Magic Circle law firms in Singapore. Doesn't practice in the Supreme Court or the Bombay High Court.
Yes.
In Singapore, that's where she goes. My wife, and although I am to blame for this, won 7 gold medals at LLM in law in Nagpur University, a record that's not been beaten till date, but finally chose to teach law.
Amazing.
Why? Practice in a court. She says that I wouldn't have given her work, and she's probably right there. But the fact remains, is not something that even the most competent ladies achieve. When I came to the bar, we had 2 lady lawyers in our bar at Nagpur. I'm talking about 1974. One was Kumkum Sirpurkar, who went on to being designated as a senior counsel. And one was Mrs. Meera Khadakkar, who went on to being principal judge of the family court. So they were not mean girls. They were not girls who didn't know what they were going on about. And yet when I asked my senior, what do these ladies do? He told me in one sentence in good old Marathi, "Tya courtat daba khayla yetat," which means they come to court to eat their tiffin in the afternoon. Now that's the level at which even an entirely enlightened senior like my own senior, who was a designated senior at a very young age, thought of women in the profession. No fault of his. I think he was the greatest teacher I've had. And to me, he is more than a father, because everything I owe to him. K.H. Deshpande. He's still alive. 96, I believe. Sharp in the head, will teach me a few things about law when he feels like it even today. But at the same time, the approach is, women, all right, they're there, but they're not really lawyers, are they? That's how we look at them.
Mr. Ane sir, and I think this is something that needs to be looked into, because when we walk in the corridors of the courts, we often come across women and they're extremely sharp and they're looking for an opportunity, and it's time that their time comes. My final question to you, Mr. Ane, what are your hobbies? What do you do in your time when you have some time with your family, with your son, with your wife that we've just heard very admiringly is so learned, Mrs. Vijay Lakshmi Ane? How do you spend time?
We travel a great deal until they locked us down in this COVID business. We've traveled almost all over the world. There's very few places I've not been to. To give you far-flung examples, I've been to the Antarctic. Not many people could claim that. I've sailed the Pacific all the way from United States to Australia. Things like that very many lawyers don't get to do. So we travel a great deal. We used to drive every year from Nagpur or Bombay all the way to Manali. We have a home there. We spend our summers in the mountains. It's very beautiful. We are there usually in April and May, that's spring, and it's just gorgeous. I read more than watch movies. I prefer reading to watching films, but I do enjoy watching certain serials on television, and my wife joins me in many of these activities. We both do that together.
Mr. Ane, as I thank you for being on the show with us, it was a pleasure to have you, to hear your views, to learn from you, and of course, most of all, to learn from the lovely stories that you told us about the legal profession. I thank you for being a part of the Legal Eagle this week. Thank you, sir.